So, hello everyone. My name is Andreea Cârstocea. I am a senior researcher at the European Center for Minority Issues, and I will be moderating today's online talk with the title, What Does the Future Hold for the Socio-Economic Participation of National Minorities? We have decided to organize such an online talk on this subject because after many, many years where a lot of the focus concerning participation of national minorities was on rather political and cultural aspects of participation, socioeconomic participation has been receiving increasing attention, both from researchers, policymakers, and also from legislators. In this context, last year, we had a very important development, namely the launch of the OSCE HCNM Thematic Recommendations on the Participation of National Minorities in Social and Economic Life. This happened in November last year, so it's a very recent event. And our conversation today will touch on the importance of socioeconomic participation, on the importance and future of these thematic recommendations. And towards the end, we will also try to look into the future and see what the future holds for the socioeconomic participation of national minorities. Just before we start, I would like to ask you if you have any questions that you would like our panelists to answer, please write them in the Q&A question and answer section on our stream. And let me introduce our guests for today. And I should say that the logic and the reason we invited these particular guests was that they are the initiators and also drafters of the thematic recommendations on socioeconomic participation launched by the HCNM last November. And I'll start alphabetically. Elzbieta Kuzborska-Pacha has been working as senior legal advisor to the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities since 2018. Prior to this, she served as a diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland. And between 2009 and 2015, she was a political expert at the Embassy of Poland in Vilnius. As an author, Elzbieta has published extensively and contributed to the discourse on national minorities and human rights, including gender equality. Her work with various NGOs and international entities has established her as a recognized human rights expert. I'll go on to Jennifer Jackson-Preece, who is Associate Professor of Nationalism at the London School of Economics and Political Science, with a joint appointment in the European Institute and the Department of International Relations. Dr. Jackson-Preece is an expert on problems and practices of nationalism, human and minority rights, and conflict prevention. She has published extensively on these topics in books, journals, and blogs. Dr. Jackson-Preece has an established track record as a policy advisor to governments, international organizations, and NGOs, and she has cooperated previously with the OSCE HCNM on the Ljubljana Guidelines on Integration of Diverse Societies, the Graz Recommendations on Access to Justice for National Minorities, and the Tallinn Guidelines on National Minorities and the Media in the Digital Age. And last but not least, Fernand de Varennes is adjunct professor in human rights at the National University of Ireland, Galway, as well as visiting professor at the Université Catholique de Lyon in France and at the University of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. He also held between August 2017 and November 2024 the mandate of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. He is renowned as one of the world's leading experts on the international human rights of minorities, issues surrounding languages, and the prevention of ethnic conflicts. He has been awarded prizes from Germany, Spain, the United Kingdom, and Poland, and has some 300 publications in more than 30 languages. So, this being said, let me first of all thank you all very, very much for taking the time to participate in this online talk. And I would like to open the floor with a very general question. And I was wondering, Jennifer, if you could expand a little on why is socioeconomic participation important? Among people who work on this topic, we kind of understand why, but it would be, I think, interesting also for the wider audience to sort of have a better understanding of what socioeconomic participation is all about, where its importance lies, and why we should be pushing and promoting for national minorities to be better able to engage in socioeconomic activities in everyday life.
Thanks, Andreea. I think it's actually a really important question to ask because there can be an erroneous assumption that when we are talking about minority questions, minority rights, we are thinking of a much more siloed approach that only or exclusively focuses on political or cultural rights. And that is entirely short-sighted, and it misses the bigger point about what the purpose of thinking about minority rights is really intended to do. And that is, of course, to look at the comprehensive circumstances of minorities and want to make sure that persons belonging to them have an equal opportunity to fully not only express and develop their distinct identities, but also be fully and completely a part of the societies in which they live, which means, of course, that they have equal opportunities to be able to engage in that full range of social and economic life, which is such a fundamental hallmark of what it means to be a part of society. This is also, of course, a fundamental connection to the broader idea of human rights, of which minority rights is a part. And there as well, important to underscore that social and economic inequality and exclusion affects individuals' daily lives. It fundamentally affects their ability, for instance, to care for themselves, to support their families, to have thriving communities, and to be able, as a result of all of that, to contribute to society. So we need to see this as a core component also of the impact and ability to enjoy other human rights. Obviously, if you do not have sufficient basic standards of living, your ability as well to engage in a broader range of human rights, indeed to be able to do those political and cultural activities that perhaps we more kind of quintessentially or stereotypically associate with minorities. Without that basic standard of living, none of that is going to happen. At the same time, of course, by promoting this, we are also promoting the integration of diverse societies. You mentioned when you introduced me that I was involved in the Ljubljana guidelines, and I see a very strong correlation between what we are aiming to achieve in the guidelines on social and economic inclusion and what was the intention with and through Ljubljana. I mean, this is really another way to reinforce that broader strategy of wanting to arrive at a situation where all members of society are integrated within it, feel themselves to be a recognized part of it, feel themselves to be making that dignified contribution to it. And then finally, although to be very honest, for me, this is actually the final remark, but still an important one. Finally, of course, by promoting social and economic inclusion of minorities, indeed of society more generally, we do obviously also promote overall economic growth and development. And again, this ought to be seen in the round. So these are mutually reinforcing processes. I don't know if I have time to give a quick example around minority women and youth. Yes?
Yes, please.
One of the ways I think that this logic really becomes clear is if we point to particular sets of circumstances. And a set of circumstances that I think has become very apparently one of high strategic significance in the last few years, not least because of the COVID pandemic, is the circumstances of women and youth who belong to minorities. And if we recall what it was like to go through that horrible moment of lockdown, what you saw very clearly revealed was the precarity associated with being a member of a minority, but also, of course, additionally, being a woman, being a young person, because that coming together of these different identities in that broader intersectional way, which is also a core assumption of the recommendations, brought to the fore mutually reinforcing patterns of discrimination and bias that disproportionately affected them. So the precariousness, for instance, of women who are disproportionately employed in the informal labor market, potentially as cleaners, for instance. All of that goes when we enter lockdowns, when people are at home. That source of income completely disappears. And because you are in the informal labor market, you do not have the evidence to be able to present to governments who are giving additional support packages for identifiable through public national insurance contributions and so on, legalized employment records, those who are suddenly having lost their income because of the pandemic emergency response. So that clearly shows for us the vulnerability that exists, and therefore the urgency in thinking through the ways in which persons who belong to minorities are affected by that overlapping sense of their identity, by their lack of full integration within society, and therefore by prioritizing this as a key component of public policies, not only in the area of minority rights, but joined up to also be in the area of job training, economic opportunity, of mentoring, indeed of health, regional development. Again, it's a comprehensive approach that we're wanting to push. It draws attention to the significance of that social and economic participation, not only for individuals, but also for their communities and society and economy writ large. I'll end it there. I know my colleagues have many more important points to make as well.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I would just like to briefly remind our guests that they can pose questions through the Q&A option you have on your options bar. So whenever you have a questions, please ask. We will be, and our guests will be delighted to answer and try to answer your questions. So Jennifer, many thanks for your answer. You focused mostly on inequalities, on socioeconomic participation as a human right. But let's also remember that the OSCE is mainly a conflict prevention institution. The mechanisms they promote focus on conflict prevention. And in this respect, Fernand, I was wondering, could you expand a bit on the link between conflict prevention and the socioeconomic participation of national minorities?
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrea. And good morning, or good morning for those of us who are in North America right now, but good afternoon to all of you, or everyone who may be in Europe. Bonjour tout le monde. I think firstly, it's important to understand what we mean by effective social participation of minorities, why it's crucial. And by the way, I would add not only minorities, but also indigenous peoples. This is also very often the case. One of the main points why it's so crucial is because, well, the socioeconomic participation of minorities is central in order to have in place measures to avoid state policies or practices or even legislation, which could lead, intentionally or not, to inequalities, discrimination, and even exclusion of minorities. Because if you have that, if you have the exclusion or discrimination or policies or practices that are detrimental to the disadvantage of minorities when it comes to their participation in society, in business, in economy, well, then you have actually an undermining of cohesion and stability. And this is also, as Jennifer has mentioned earlier, a situation which involves violations of fundamental human rights, because whenever we say discrimination, I think sometimes we tend to forget we're talking about denial of the rights of people here. Why is it important in relation to conflict prevention? Well, as you have with the guidelines on socio-economic participation of national minorities, which were just launched, as Andreea has mentioned, by the High Commissioner on National Minorities of the OSCE, we're looking at areas that involve employment, the use of minority languages as a means for minority participation and access in areas like education, healthcare, public services in general. We're talking about issues of access to land and property, and also to dealing with this, the infrastructure that you need. You need roads. You need to be able to go to the market, for example. Or you need also modern infrastructure such as reliable electricity, water and sewage, and today also the internet, to be able to fully participate in society and the economy in general. And what often happens in situations of instability or grievances and violent conflict is that you have groups that are denied, it seems to them, that have grievances over obstacles or disadvantages in terms of participating in business activity, employment, or even education in their own languages and so forth. So what you have with the idea of effective social economic participation of minorities are how can we ensure that minorities get their fair share, in a sense, to ensure that they're not denied opportunities, that are treated fairly and equally without discrimination. And if you can actually achieve that in healthcare, housing, education, and other areas, you often deal with some of the main causes of conflicts around the world. And I want to emphasize this because I don't think it's sufficiently understood right now. Dealing with the effective social and economic participation of minorities is today more important than ever in terms of conflict prevention, because I think we've failed in this area. There are now, currently in the world, more violent conflicts than we have ever had in human history, as a matter of fact, more than during the Second World War. And what is also perhaps not always understood is that most of these conflicts, violent conflicts, are internal, domestic, inside a country. And most of these involve grievances of minorities, of exclusion, of discrimination. And in fact, you could say that most of these involve claims of discrimination and exclusion in the fields of socio-economic participation. Not exclusively, not only, but many of them, even perhaps most. And what we now have for the first time, I must say, to its credit, the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities has provided guidelines as to how we can take steps, what kind of steps are necessary to try to ensure that national minorities really do have fair access and equality of treatment in terms of infrastructure, economic development, access to jobs and to services, and sometimes in their own language, public education and other public services, including public health. And that's the important lesson for conflict prevention, that there is a failure, and I must admit, even at the United Nations, to sufficiently recognize the link between the obstacles or the denial for minorities to access freely and participate in the economy and in society. There's a failure to recognize that link in conflict prevention, which thankfully we have participated in through the drafting of the guidelines from the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. And I think really this is the first time this has been the case systematically. I'll give two very quick examples because I don't want to take too much time. If you consider the situation which occurred in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s involving Quebec in Canada and South Tyrol in Italy, there were the beginning of two violent conflicts there. There were actually bombings, some even assassinations of public officials by separatist minority groups, who actually, amongst their claim, were to be able to use their language and fully participate in society. Both the French Canadians in Quebec and the German-speaking minority in northern Italy, South Tyrol, actually said that they were excluded from employment, that they were denied opportunities in quite a large number of economic fields, and also disadvantaged in education, public access to public services, and whatnot. And what happened in both of these cases was that you actually had legislation that ensured that the French-speaking Canadians and German-speaking minority in northern Italy could use their languages, also had a much larger participation through jobs in the public service, and even the degree of territorial autonomy, and the use of their language also in a variety of areas. What those efforts took, and by the way, those efforts are very much according or along the lines of what is contained in the recommendations of the High Commissioner on National Minorities on Socio-Economic Participation. The result of those measures was an increase, a significant increase of the participation of those minorities in the economy, in the employment, in the public service, in access, being able to access also their public health and education in their own language. And it really had an incredible impact on the participation of those minorities in society and resulted in fact, the ending of the violent separatist conflict and peace, not only peace and stability in Quebec and Northern and Sud Tirol, but rather prosperous societies where minorities can really be said to be fully participating. So I think those are the important lessons to keep in mind as to why these kind of recommendations on socio-economic participation actually can lead to the kind of environment which can be more stable and peaceful and just, in fact, for everyone in society.
Thank you very much, Fernand. And I would like now to ask Jennifer, Elzbieta, as one of the initiators of the HCNM's Thematic Recommendations on the Socio-Economic Participation of National Minorities, whether she can give us a little bit on the context in which these recommendations emerged, the idea of the recommendations, why now, and how did this all come about?
Thank you, Andreea. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. So indeed, socioeconomic participation of national minorities has been the focus and the priority of the Office of HCNM for 5 years now. And during that time, we organized a series of expert roundtables, initiated a few studies, including the complex and overarching study presented by ECMI, and Andreea was one of the drafters there. We also, during that period, organized a number of international and OSCE events on the topic, including at universal UN level in Geneva and New York. And this was to actually build our strong in-office knowledge and capacity that we could then materialize in the establishment of a group of experts and then producing our newest set of recommendations. And this exercise allowed us indeed to successfully finalize the project last October in Geneva with the exceptional group of experts, and I would like to indeed commend all of them, most of them present today. We miss Jennifer Croft and William Romans. The newest set of HCNM recommendations on the effective participation of national minorities in social and economic life are indeed a document that is very firmly anchored in the OSCE obligations and the UN framework. It is also written from the perspective of our mandate with references to the previous HCNM recommendations and guidelines, as Jennifer already mentioned. And personally, I found there all the components and ingredients necessary to convey our conflict prevention messages that first and foremost, socioeconomic inclusion and socioeconomic participation, active participation of national minorities could be and should be perceived as an important factor contributing to overall prosperity, overall peace and stability of our societies, including women and youth angle, as was mentioned by Jennifer. So now I would maybe like to briefly present you the rationale, the importance of the topic of socioeconomic participation of minorities, and indeed why HCNM decided to deal with it after all the series of different thematic emphasis in different thematic organizations. So why indeed socioeconomic recommendations? So first and foremost, we perceive socioeconomic participation as a key for integration. And now you may disagree with me, but from my perspective, economic participation, effective social participation is of primary importance, and not only for national or other minorities. And here political or cultural participation are seen only as a secondary dimension of social exclusion or social inclusion. So the question whether we have the formal possibility to vote or not, to join a political party or a cultural association, is probably less relevant for us when compared to very, very basic needs, such as to generate an income and for food, for health insurance, for housing, and to get a basic education for our children. And secondly, it's important also to bear in mind that a certain degree of inequality in a society is itself nothing to worry about. However, the optimal amount and effects of such disparities are disputed, especially when social and economic inequalities and divisions are outlined along ethnic or national lines. And at the same time, it's important to bear in mind, and I will repeat what was already said, that communities and regions and countries have everything to gain from a greater involvement of national minorities in social and economic life, as this indeed directly contributes to overall prosperity and development. And please note that economic exclusion is never strictly a question of insufficient material resources. Exclusion is an issue of being in or being out, rather than being rich or poor. And this is indeed very strongly linked with national integration, regional development policies orchestrated by decision makers and politicians. So in other words, from HCNM's perspective, economic inclusion and empowerment of minorities is important for three main reasons: security argument, economic prosperity argument, and anti-discrimination legal argument. And as you know, OSCE, these three arguments are directly related to the organization's notion of comprehensive security, as it encompasses three distinct but interrelated dimensions of political, military, economic, and environmental and human dimension. So by this particular thematic work, our office kind of bridges all three dimensions, contributing to holistic understanding of integration as a multi-layered process. So if I'm just briefly to unpack those three arguments, the first security argument, there's a strong security argument against the socioeconomic exclusion of minorities, because once mobilized, the continuous and systematic socioeconomic marginalization of a particular identity group can increase the likelihood of interethnic mistrust, fear, and competition for scarce resources. In other words, equal economic opportunities for members of minorities in the OSCE area and beyond are important from peace and security perspective. And various political economy and development studies have shown that low rates of economic growth, inequalities in income level, and low per capita income in general increase the risk of such minorities or such groups engaging in violent dissent. The second legal argument, from this perspective, discrimination based on race, ethnicity, language, religion, as we all know, or any other identity marker, is prohibited on numerous national jurisdictions and supranational levels. So we have to also bear in mind that non-discrimination clause in socioeconomic contexts goes beyond the formal provision of prohibiting direct discrimination. And in practice, it aims towards effective economic inclusion. And as a result, involves positive actions and incentives on the part of authorities to make this inclusion and participation possible. In other words, for effective socioeconomic inclusion, the pure legislation that bans discrimination is insufficient. And by the text of recommendations, we encourage authorities to do more and to pay special attention to the topic. And finally, the economic development argument that was also already mentioned is about promoting economic growth of regions, of countries. And let's see and admit that minorities are frequently untapped resource in terms of economic prosperity for entire community, not only for the members of minority in question, because by using the intellectual capital that minorities have to offer, states and regions can develop in a way that would be not possible if their skills were left to go to waste. And conversely, if minorities remain uneducated, underpaid, and underemployed, the economy of entire country or region will suffer. So successful models of multi-ethnic societies, such as already mentioned Südtirol, Åland Islands, show that ethnic diversity can be and should be associated with prosperity and high living standards. So this was my brief justification why HCNM decided to look into socioeconomic inclusion and of minorities and produce specific guidelines on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a comprehensive answer. Meanwhile, we started receiving questions from those attending our online talk. We will try to answer them all, but I would start now with a question which kind of fits this, let's say, more general description of the thematic guidelines. And we'll try to approach the next questions in our following sections. So one of the questions asks, when preparing the guidelines, did you look at various geographical areas for cases? And if yes, can you tell if there are different socioeconomic participation challenges or policies depending on the region? So I don't know who would like to sort of answer this.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting to point out that there is actually even a regional focus within the guidelines themselves, which in fact acknowledges this point. So obviously, in any given region, there will be a unique constellation of issues having to do with social and economic affairs, and most relevant when we think not only of integration, but also, of course, of development. So the guidelines themselves do include a regional development section, which does speak to these issues and really wants to focus the mind of the policymakers, but also those more broadly who are engaged in these sorts of issues about the need to think through how these dynamics work in that given place. Thinking, for instance, about border regions, about what it means to be a border region, in particular, the unique dilemmas that present if you are, potentially more remote from the geographic, economic decision-making center of a country, everything to do with infrastructural development, making sure that this is done in a way that connects communities so that they are able to engage fully within the economy. An example always close to my own thinking in all of this, and actually relates to another section of the guidelines, the digital guidelines, when we're thinking, for instance, about the need increasingly to ensure there is equal access to broadband, for example. Part of that, of course, has very much to do with the existence of those connectivities in a particular region. And we know that the patterns of development do disclose more remote and border regions have a lesser form of investment within this. And because of that, the consequences in terms of not only being able to benefit from new digital economies, but also to enable those within the region to develop the necessary skill sets to take advantage of this in terms of business opportunities is diminished. So to be aware of this and to be ensuring in local and regional planning that due regard is given to making that provision, the appropriate provision, that will create the level playing field for everyone within society, irrespective of where they are living, to fully benefit from these opportunities is absolutely a core component of the recommendations.
Jennifer, thank you very much for answering this, and so for very nicely segueing into the next section of our conversation. We thought it would be interesting for those listening to us to get an idea about the structure and the contents of the recommendations and about the specific areas that they cover. And obviously, the recommendations are online for anyone to read and to check. Very briefly, there are several main sections in these recommendations. Some of them refer to policies, processes, and kinds of institutions that need to be set up or improved in order to facilitate the socioeconomic participation of minorities. There is a section dealing with public goods and services, and here you have, if you want, the classic policy areas: education, housing, healthcare, employment, so basic classic areas of intervention in terms of socioeconomic participation. But also there is a discussion about geographic and regional dimensions, which you just pointed out, and one which I think is very new, and I'm not sure. I think we should sort of try to speak a little bit about it. A specific section is dedicated to digital inclusion of national minorities. And Jennifer, since you started sort of mentioning, describing it a bit, I was just wondering if you can speak a little bit more and explain what digital inclusion involves. Why is it necessary for socioeconomic participation of minorities? So why did you include this section in the recommendations?
It's a great question. I have to confess, it's actually one of my favorite parts of the guideline. The reason being is it's really endeavoring to future-proof the continued significance of the guidelines. Those of you who can recall these sorts of conversations, I date myself when I say it. You know, for example, when we used to be talking 20 years ago around the media and minorities, we were, of course, focusing on television and radio and print media. And now when I say this to students in my classroom, their eyes kind of glaze over. I do present myself to be a bit of a dinosaur. And I think being cognizant of the huge technological change that we have seen and the particular significance of the digital revolution, which is indeed having an enormous impact across the full range of activities that we associate with social and economic life, it seemed entirely reasonable, indeed prudent, to begin at least to think through what the implications of this transformation will be for minorities, not least because the very moment when we were creating these guidelines was that pandemic moment when the whole world seemed to move online, when issues of connectivity became ever more obvious. Again, I've mentioned youth already. Young people who are from minority backgrounds had disproportionate loss of education through the pandemic in significant measure because they did not have the technical ability to be able to move online when education and learning went online. And again, that's because they might not have had access to the technologies in their home, the broadband infrastructure, the devices. They might have lacked the confidence and the ability to use them. Their parents might have lacked that and been unable to support it. So there was a whole nested series of ways in which at the very moment where we were discussing and drafting, by the way, online on Zoom for much of it, just to underscore the point. All of these questions really were very apparent. So that section is an endeavor to engage with the changes and to begin to lay out some important considerations that we hope will be a good building block going forward as this particular aspect of our lives, no doubt, continues to become ever more significant. So what then is this idea of digital inclusion? It's got digital in front of it, but the basic fundamental idea is very much focused on inclusion and thinking about how that would manifest in the context of a new digital reality. So the idea is to move towards a condition where all individuals in society, including persons belonging to minorities, can access and fully utilize the new information and communication technologies that we have. And so we need to be thinking about making sure we have that as our goal and we are furthering it and fostering it. And how do we go about doing that? Well, in part, of course, this has to do with making sure that there is suitable provision everywhere for the basis of that technology that gets us into the broadband infrastructure, relating very much to some of these regional questions. In part, it also has to do with skills development, with thinking through our educational curricula, with thinking through job and training and retraining opportunities, making sure that they are there in a language that minorities can understand to facilitate the development of those skills. That when minorities go online, this is a very important point, there is suitable content for them that is culturally relevant, it's linguistically relevant, that it's not just them consuming content, but them also creating content. Again, that's fundamental to being able to engage fully in a new digital society and economy. We want minorities to produce as well as to consume, and that's part of how we ensure that the content will be suitable for them, and also that they will be fully contributing to this new digital world, which is coming into being. So it's really thinking through policy at not only the network connectivity level and the application and interface level, but also obviously the end user level, and thinking about that in the round. There was a question I noticed in the chat, which I think also speaks to this, by, I'm sorry if I'm going to say your name incorrectly, Mirko Savkovic, about what minorities can actually do to be a part of all of this. First point, clearly this isn't just an onus on minorities, it's an onus on everyone. And in particular, of course, governments need to be taking the lead in it as part of their general governance responsibilities. But clearly we do want to facilitate participation, and persons belonging to minorities should feel that they have opportunities to come forward and to develop their own responses. As we were doing some of the research that went into this, one of the key initiatives in this particular area that really attracted my attention, something that is referred to as a first mile initiative, which has come out, for example, of Indigenous communities in North America and Canada, responding to a lack of infrastructure that will allow them to connect up. In other words, insufficient broadband infrastructure. And normally, peripheral regions, when seen from the center, are the last mile to be connected. But instead, these Indigenous communities developed their own way of looking at this and called it the first mile initiative. So instead of waiting for the big technology companies and infrastructure to come to them, they went to those technologies. They said, we're here, we want to be a part of this. They became involved in the planning. Through that planning, they worked in partnership with those who were bringing in the infrastructure. It involved skills training across the whole community, so that community itself acquired the skills to be able to maintain that infrastructure and have the confidence in fully being able to use it. So again, looking at that as a partnership between what the community regards as important for itself, for its own development, and then working together with government, with the providers of the digital technology to make sure that what was actually created was the most appropriate for that particular community and its future.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And we have one last question right now, and I think it ties also very nicely with the part of the conversation we're at right now. We have a question asking whether integration of minorities means participation in decision-making through quotas in local councils, for instance. And if yes, do we need a strategy of how to push states to approve this positive discrimination? So fundamentally, I think, Fernand, I was wondering if you could comment on this. What are, the most important mechanisms through which we can achieve socioeconomic participation of national minorities? And also, how can we persuade states, which sometimes are unwilling for a variety of reasons, how can we persuade states to institute these measures or to set up these institutions?
Thank you very much. I think I'll start at the very end. States and governments really should want stable and prosperous countries. And the best way to ensure prosperous and stable societies is to make sure that everyone is treated fairly. Everyone has a fair go, a possibility of contributing and participating fully. And so partially, there are many different measures that needs to be done or can be done to try to achieve that. But in some of the examples that I gave you earlier, for example, in Quebec and Südtirol in Italy, we could add also the Åland Islands in Finland, which Elzbieta referred to. In all of those situations, you had territorial and other type of measures, including by using a minority language for public services and employment purposes, which in the end gave more opportunities to minorities to make sure that they are able to directly have a say through some form of territorial autonomy. Now, that's not the only approach, but I just want to point out that that actual approach is what you find in situations that emerge in Canada and Northern Italy, and it worked. It actually were a situation where structurally you provided the kind of political form and say, if you will, that allowed minorities within those territories to actually have influence, to actually have a degree of control over the policies, the programs, the economic development initiatives that local governments could provide. So that was those were quite effective, in fact, in ensuring a fair and stable and prosperous societies in all of those cases. But there's more that can be done. And I think one of those aspects, which is important and is connected to the human rights dimension, there has to be strong legislation against discrimination. You need laws that clearly protect individuals against all forms of discrimination in all activities, all the initiatives of the state, on the basis of ethnicity, nationality, language, or religion, and so on. And a strong human rights protection, in some cases, can avoid situations where, even because of the region or because of various preferences or priorities, strong legislation can avoid, for example, that you might have a government development program, economic development initiative, which favors certain regions and kind of neglects regions which are either more isolated or where minorities actually live. So you need strong legislation to avoid situations of exclusion, of creating, intentionally or not, disadvantages that affect minorities in their own participation or enjoyment of, for example, economic development programs. And this can be and should be applied to all areas, including, for example, infrastructure decisions. Where are roads built? Where do you have strong Wi-Fi, digital access? And even in terms of what kind of schools are available. History shows us in too many parts of Europe, by the way, in the world, that you sometimes have areas where minorities are concentrated, which have schools that are actually less well equipped. They don't have as much access as majority schools to modern computers, to the Wi-Fi, to the internet, to sporting equipment, and so on. So that kind of legislation is also an appropriate way to try to improve and make sure that the socioeconomic participation of minorities is equal and fair. And finally, really to answer his question more directly, local councils, the issue of quota is always a very sensitive one, a difficult one, particularly in Europe. I would suggest that where possible and appropriate, territorial autonomy arrangements are proven to actually work for minorities in terms of increasing their participation, or other kind of programs that would encourage voting and political participation of minorities, including by the use of a language in fact, political, in elections, during elections, in also various forms of political participation. That actually is a proven method to increase minority presence in many parts of the world. So I think I will have to probably stop there for now and perhaps give Ella, she might have something to contribute also.
Thank you, Fernand. Indeed, I agree with everything that you just mentioned, that a proper legislation with specific arrangement allowing for effective inclusion of most marginalized, of minorities in decision-making processes is the key. It is a basic factor and the start of any processes that would lead to greater cohesion and peace, stability, or inclusion. And before having this legislation in place, before having those draft legislation pieces being discussed in national parliaments, we have to create a political will to do so, to push for those initiatives, to adopt those initiatives. And our task as international experts, our task as international organizations firmly anchored in conflict prevention, is to create this political will on the part of governments and decision makers around the OSCE area and way beyond. So I would say that this set of 10 recommendations of HCNM, its main aim, its main goal was indeed to bring the attention of national decision makers to this link that we just discussed between socioeconomic inclusion and conflict prevention, and assist national decision makers with setting right policies in this regard, policies that aim at the cohesion, conflict prevention, and inclusion of minorities in socioeconomic settings. That would be my comment to what was just said.
Thank you very much, Elzbieta. In the guidelines, but not only, in general, when we discuss socioeconomic participation of national minorities, there is also the aspect of intersectionality that we should keep in mind, and which is also reflected in the thematic recommendations. And I was just wondering, Jennifer, if you could just briefly speak about how grassroots organizations can promote socioeconomic inclusion for minority women, for minority youth, and whether there are any ways in which states support or can support such initiatives.
Thanks, Andreea. Yeah, it's also a really interesting question. And again, I think addresses some of the comments that we did have within our chat, because this as well speaks to the point about what minorities themselves can do. Grassroots organizations are very important because they are, of course, closest to where the minorities themselves are. And indeed, many of them often come out of those communities and are, in that sense, a form of the minorities' participation and self-representation. So when we look at it in this way, I think we need to acknowledge that through the grassroots organization, we come closer to that lived experience of the minority and are therefore much more responsive to local circumstances. The local circumstances themselves will always be intersectional in the sense that all aspects of inequality are always intersectional, which is a core foundational presumption of the guidelines, meaning that we all of us experience the coming together of different aspects of ourselves in ways that may push towards advantage in social and economic participation, or may pull towards disadvantage and exclusion. And I've already mentioned some of the dynamics which we can see. Certainly there is the broad generalizable trend that where we look at the intersections between gender and minority background and age, we often see this effect. Again, I've already mentioned some of my earlier remarks about women from minority backgrounds being disproportionately represented in the informal labor market, perhaps struggling more in order to be able to carry on with education and advanced job training because of carer responsibilities, perhaps having difficulties being able to fully access medical care, again, because they are not heard in the same way that others are, due to the coming together of both potential bias based on ethnic identity and potential bias based on gender identity. So again, through grassroots organizations, it's an opportunity for those individuals, women's organizations, for instance, to push forward the empowerment of individuals that are more marginalized and make sure that their views are here. There are a number of interesting examples. One of them caught my eye, and apologies because this does speak back to the digital point yet again, which is one that interests me intellectually, so I've done a fair bit of reading in and around it. But there was a very interesting group called the Roma Women Students Gathering in Barcelona, which has organized for many years in order to try and promote the educational inclusion of girls and women who are Roma. And because it was a very immediate and local organization, when the pandemic hit, instead of just disappearing, it actually was able to work with the local community to be able to hold events that were hybrid, because this was in an intimate location and there were real human relationships. It was possible to assist with some of the provision of necessary technology. It was possible for women to work together to acquire skills and then share them with others, so that community's efforts to ensure that young women were able to carry on with their studies was very successful. And again, it speaks volumes about why grassroots organizations should be recognized as a fundamental component of policymaking in this area, and really a key to the success of these sorts of economic and social participation measures that we hope that we will be seeing more of, and indeed also what real integration looks like when you have these organizations that can act and can be inclusive of their own members and can really have that impact in terms of what they hope to achieve.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I think we're slowly getting closer to the end of our conversation. And I noticed there are a few questions that popped up just now. I think we're slowly running out of time. But I would encourage everyone to write an email to our speakers or to us, and we'll try to answer that. So before we say goodbye for today, I really have a question for all three of you. And this relates to what the future holds for socioeconomic participation. So, and I would like you, if possible, to reflect from your own perspectives. I don't know, Elzbieta, from the perspective of the HCNM's office and from the thematic recommendations, what do you think will happen in the future? What kind of impact will the recommendations have?
I see the very bright future for this document. And I'm really convinced that this document will find its rightful place on decision makers, on the tables of decision makers and politicians around the OSCE area, and will be widely used, and will create this political will that will lead to legislation that will lead to implementation and effective policies in the area of socioeconomic inclusion, even beyond OSCE area. And why? because I'm convinced, and I will advocate it anywhere, that this document provides a very detailed and toolbox on matters that were discussed and of matters of paramount importance for each and every society. How to make our community more cohesive, more prosperous, and thus resistant to conflict. And I think the timing also of issuing this document was really good. It has been already discussed widely during the recent UN Minority Forum in Geneva last December, dedicated to social cohesion and economic participation. Also, last year, it was this document in a way complemented the human rights economy doctrine launched by UNHCR, or, for example, Global Coalition for Social Justice initiated by ILO. We already in the office received multiple requests from national authorities to organize roundtables, presentations in different capitals. The authorities are willing to translate it to national languages. So I'm really positive about the outreach, about the impact that those recommendations will have on national decisions on national development strategies, on national integration concepts.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Do you share this optimism?
I do. I think this is a real landmark document. And what makes it a landmark document is that it pulls together elements that have been scattered about other very important documents. Obviously, some of them indeed from the Office of the High Commissioner. I'm thinking of Ljubljana, for instance, but also we see this clearly apparent intimations of this in the Framework Convention for National Minorities. We see it in some of the statements we've had recently from the World Bank on ethnic conflict, obviously as well from the UN Special Representative on Minorities. And when you can see that there has been this current of thought and elements of recommendations present across such a range, I think it is the clear indication, which was one of the big insights that the HCNM team made, that we needed to bring that together for a coherent statement. And that's exactly what these documents provide. So it takes all of that disparate thinking and it gives it a clear and coherent point of reference. And in doing that, I think it also opens up very important space for cross-institutional coalescing around a similar orientation in order to really push through with the outcomes of what is being suggested here. And again, really to echo what Elzbieta has already said, we can see this happening. So we can clearly see this issue being taken up at the UN. We can see it as well being discussed in other European fora, particularly, of course, the Council of Europe. And I'm certainly very heartened to hear the feedback that's been coming from national governments, but not at all surprised, because again, this is immediately relevant to the world in which we find ourselves in when we are now looking at a return of inflation, when we do have widening economic gaps within society. It once more really underscores the fundamental importance of taking this core aspect of the integration of societies and its economic development seriously.
Thank you very much. Fernand, in the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned we are at a moment in history with more violent conflicts than ever. So what do you think also in terms of the future of socioeconomic participation of minorities? You have tremendous experience both academically, but also as a special rapporteur for minority issues at the UN. What can you share with us? Do you have the same optimism?
Optimism in the sense that we have done an important step in the right direction with these guidelines. finally clarifying what needs to be done in terms of ensuring fair socioeconomic participation of minorities. But also I'll be a bit more critical in a sense that on the one hand, it's absolutely essential that we move and work in this recognition of the importance of this as a conflict prevention tool. But obviously we've been failing, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere in the world, the number of conflicts is increasing. We have record levels, and many of these involve minorities. Why? Because I think there's been a denial, and even there is a need for reform. European institutions, unfortunately, have not always even recognized that minorities are excluded, are disadvantaged, that their language and identity are important and need to put it into place. And we now have a situation, in fact, where there's a contradiction between the UN system and the European institutions. We've had cases at the International Court of Justice recently, which indicated that the Ukrainian minority in Russia have the right to education in their own language. That's great. But at the same time, the European Court of Human Rights indicated that the Russian minority in Latvia does not have the right to education in their own language. The two, and we see these contradictions between the UN human rights system and the European human rights system, in these contradictions also involving religious minorities. Religious minorities have human rights at the international level, which is denied by the European Court. We need reform because I think we can see right now that in Europe, despite significant developments over decades to better identify what are the human rights of minorities, in practice, even European institutions are unwilling to comply with this. And I say this, and I'll use rather challenging language. There is a need of reform because it is easy for European institutions to deny or ignore the rights of minorities. And this is what needs to be addressed with guidelines like this. We have, unfortunately, in relation to the European Union, a rejection of a petition by 1 million people who wanted better legal protection of minorities. The European Commission simply said, not necessary, everything is perfect within the EU for minorities. That's nonsense. So we need much more reform because, and I'll add this final point, the European Court of Human Rights basically referred to even the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities as not representing a European consensus, and therefore it could ignore it. The European Court of Human Rights completely ignored in recent decisions all of the contributions from the High Commissioner on National Minorities in terms of all kinds of guidelines, basically by saying, well, these are not legally binding, we'll not consider them, period. I think there's a serious challenge here that needs to be done by European institutions in recognizing these necessary steps to ensure the full protection of the rights of minorities, including socioeconomic participation. And until now, this is simply not happening. We've identified the standards, the direction. I think young researchers have to look into why this is happening so much, why there is a denial of the rights of minorities, and even by the European Court of Human Rights, which usually uses the doctrine of a margin of appreciation to kind of push aside and, in fact, ignore the rights of minorities. There's a lot to be done, and these are extremely challenging and even darker time for the protection of the rights of minorities in Europe and elsewhere.
So what I'll take from this, your advice for cautious optimism and continuing to monitor and promote socioeconomic participation. So now is my turn to say thank you very much to all of the speakers for a very interesting conversation, a very rewarding conversation. It has been a pleasure to host this conversation. For our listeners, many thanks for joining us. I hope we managed to respond to most of your questions fully. For any outstanding questions, please feel free to contact us. Should you wish to watch again this online talk, it will be available on ECMI's webpage. And of course, do check our socials, our Facebook, Twitter, X, and LinkedIn accounts, where you will see updates about our activities. Thank you very much. Good evening. Have Have a nice day ahead, Fernand. And I hope to see you again at some point.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir tout le monde. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.